This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Today, we are excited to sit down with popular Old Testament scholar Peter Enns in advance of next week's release of The Evolution of Adam, 10th Anniversary Edition, What the Bible Does and Doesn't Say About Human Origins. Can Christianity and evolution coexist? Traditional Christian teachings presents Jesus as reversing the effects of the fall of Adam. But an evolutionary view of human origins doesn't allow for a literal Adam, making evolution seemingly incompatible with what Genesis and the Apostle Paul say about him. For Christians who both accept evolution and want to take the Bible seriously, this can present a faith-shaking tension. Popular Old Testament scholar Peter Enns offers a way forward by explaining how this tension is caused not by the discoveries of science, but by false expectations about the biblical texts. In this 10th anniversary edition, Dr. Enns updates readers on developments in the historical Adam debate, helping them reconcile Genesis and Paul with current views on evolution and human origins. This edition also includes an afterword that explains Enns' own theological evolution since the first edition released.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be listening. Welcome back to the Vicar's Crossing podcast. My name is Rob Henderson, and I am the vicar, one of the vicars, and I'm a vicar at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church here in London with that vicar.
That guy right there is Rob.
There he is. There's me. I'm on a mug.
If you're on YouTube, I'm showing you a picture of Rob.
Yeah.
I'm Kevin George. I'm the other vicar on the mug. I'm from... let me see, St. Aidan's Anglican Church over in Northwest London. Glad to be with you.
My name is Ian. I'm a singer-songwriter, producer, and the person who gets this out to your ear holes.
The man. And the Vicar's Crossing is the virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And we're glad we're back. It's good to see you guys again. We're glad today we have another wonderful guest. As my good friend and our good friend of the podcast, Reverend Michael Decay, said to me at a meeting, you guys are getting some awesome guests.
We are.
So shout out to Michael. Thanks for listening. And you're right. And we've got another one today. And he was actually asking about our guest today because he's a big fan. Yep. We're welcoming professor and author Peter Enns to the Vicar's Crossing. Peter has written some wonderful books, among them The Sin of Certainty, The Bible Tells Me So, How the Bible Actually Works. And next week, or is coming up with the release of the 10th anniversary edition of his groundbreaking work titled The Evolution of Adam. And he's also a podcaster, and the podcast is called The Bible for Normal People, Kevin.
Great podcast. So not for me, because I'm
not for you, but others might want to take a listen. And it's really, really good. So we'll talk to him today about the re-release of his book and his podcast and much, much more.
Awesome. But before we do any of that, we want to acknowledge that the grounds upon which we record this podcast are the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples on the lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse indigenous peoples, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations, for whom we offer the utmost respect and with whom we wish to work in order to bring about vital change and reconciliation in our communities.
Mm-hmm. And we are always appreciative of our sponsors here on the Vicar's Crossing. So big shout out to them. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And our thanks to our good friend Dave Mullen over at A. Miller George and his great staff there for supporting our podcast.
Hey, did you guys, before I go on, did you guys hear the good news that the province is up the attendance now at hockey games, right?
Yes.
So
yes.
now there's full capacity for the night games. So we can expect a call from our sponsor, Dave Mullen and A. Miller George.
All right, Dave.
About,
I've got my
got
silent
that written down.
off
Everybody,
on the
right?
iPhone.
Everybody, the phone is ready, Dave. We're waiting on you. Oh, and our other sponsors, we're thankful for Carol Basada of Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Get your prescription shifted from your big box operation to a local neighborhood pharmacy with incredible people. Hello to Jing Jing over there as well. I'll say hello, shout out to Jing Jing as well as to Carol Basada.
And last, but certainly not least, a huge special thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And Trisha Lister was the human being that hooked us up with that one. Lovely people over there. They'll walk in, waltz in, clean your stuff, clean your floors, do all that magic with those cleaning supplies. It'll look great. And yeah, so give them a shout.
Yes.
They're wonderful over there.
Call Trisha today.
They're
all
good
right.
people,
Good.
right?
Good. They are good people. So just before we bring Peter in for our discussion, it's time for everybody's favorite segment here on the Vicar's Crossing. Ladies and gentlemen, we are happy to bring to you, hey, Kevin, who in the world did we book this week?
Well, am I ever glad you asked. Drum roll, please. Okay, guys, finally we get a drum roll in here. The person we booked, who in the world did we book this week? Reached out to us this week was Professor Aubrey Hendricks. Aubrey Hendricks has a new book being released called Christians Against Christianity. And you will probably not necessarily pick up on the name right away, but if you saw Professor Hendricks, you'd recognize him from CNN, MSNBC, ABC, where he's often on commentating on the state of politics and religion. This guy is a Ph.D. from Princeton. He teaches in the Department of Religion and African American Dysphoria Studies at Columbia University. He's an incredible author with an incredible book coming out, and he'll be coming up in the new year. But we booked him this week. That is who we have coming up on the Vicar's Crossing.
Looking forward to it. And looking forward to talking to Dr. Peter Enns, who is joining us, and I believe he's coming in right now. So let's bring him in and start our chat on the Vicar's Crossing podcast.
Peter, how you do? Come on in and sit down.
And we are so happy to welcome to the Vicar's Crossing today, Dr. Peter Enns joining us. And Peter, thank you so much. We really appreciate you giving us the time today. How are you doing?
Yeah, absolutely, Rob. Thanks. Doing great.
Very good.
I'm on sabbatical. I do nothing. I watch TV.
Oh, okay.
That's a lie.
Yeah.
I'm working, but it's sort of nice to have a different rhythm. Getting paid to do nothing is a great gig. I'm telling you.
Goal in life.
I know.
Yeah.
I make note. Dr. Enns
Rob, isn't
says,
that what we do? I mean, we only work on Sundays.
That's true. Only work an hour a week anyway. So yeah.
So
exactly.
where in the world are you coming to us from?
Outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
All right.
So I'm about 45 minutes north, and the next town people outside of Pennsylvania might have heard of is Allentown because of Billy Joel.
Of course, Billy Joel.
So that's about 45 minutes north of here. I'm sort of equidistant from Allentown in the north and Philadelphia in the south, and that borders New Jersey, which is where I grew up in that state. So
awesome. Well, we brought together Pennsylvania and London, Ontario today. So how's everything down there? Good.
That's right. You guys are Canadian. You have internet. That's great.
Well, I know.
Right.
We actually have an antenna hanging off of our moose antlers just outside.
Yeah, we have 2 polar bears on treadmills to get it going.
Oh, I thought you had beavers, but that's okay.
That's
we have beavers.
It depends on region.
All right.
Anyway, look, we're glad you're here. We're not talking about this book today, but it's right in front of me, so I got to pick it up. This was my introduction to you, actually. I picked this book up at a clergy conference. And I thought, wow, this clergy conference is good. They got good books. And since then, I've read The Sin of Certainty and How the Bible Works. But one of your earliest books is The Evolution of Adam. Or at least it's 10 years old now because it's being right here re-released.
Yes,
next week. Pretty exciting.
Fun story if you guys want to hear it.
Hey, let's hear it.
We were debating art for the cover because they wanted to change it, which is great. I love that cover. But one of them was a couple of pomegranates hanging off a branch. And I don't need, I mean, maybe I don't need this.
You don't need to say it. No.
But I said, you know what that looks like. And like, that's the last thing I need in my life right
that's
now.
Not the evolution. That's not the evolution of Adam. That's really something. That's something.
The unpantsing of Adam.
That's the unpantsing of Adam.
That's Adam naked in the garden is what it is. So
cover yourself.
I said, maybe we can think of another concept. I don't know. So, but it's, you know, the tree there in the middle, the tree of life, tree of the knowledge of good and evil, whichever one that is. But
I love it.
It works.
Well, it's a beautiful cover. I like it. I like the redo of it. I want to begin our conversation about this 10th anniversary edition, which is coming out on October the 19th. So depending on when you listen to this, I think it may be out just a day. And so you're right fresh on it. So I want to begin at the end of that edition, if I can, because you write an afterword, which is, you know, sort of catching people up on the last decade. Mm-hmm. You re-emphasize that the main tenets of your book remain relevant to you, but you add some new insights, noting that the question of Adam vis-a-vis biological evolution must be set against the backdrop of the meta-narrative of evolution. And I'm just going to quote a bit from the book and get you to expand on this a bit. You write, "What has changed is this: I've come to see the need for theology to grapple more with the broader scientific landscape within which biological evolution is but one small part, and then see how all of this affects and informs how we talk about God. Evolution is a theory that explains not just the emergence of life on this planet, but emergence of the cosmos as a whole, from the Big Bang to this moment nearly 14 billion years later. Evolution is the indisputable meta-narrative of how all things came to be. It is the story that accounts for cosmological, geological, and biological reality." You go on a little later to say, "The universe is disarmingly huge, and the thought of all this makes me freeze in my tracks. We cannot carry on with theological categories that conceive of God in the world in ways that arose before our immense, incomprehensive, expanding, and very weird universe came to light. The profound discoveries of the last 100 years especially have changed forever how we perceive reality, of which human origins are just one part. These are the much bigger issues before us, and they throw into sharp relief the relatively comprehensible, even pedestrian theological challenges presented by biological evolution. Evangelical theology cannot rest content hammering out the Adam question vis-a-vis biological evolution in isolation from the bigger issues that are before us." Further on, you say that theology cannot be disassociated with science. Tell us more about the marvel of it all. I mean, listen, I'm not a cosmologist or a particle scientist or anything like that. We had one on the show, actually. We had Chandra Prescott Weinstein on. Incredible guest. She has a great book out talking about all this, and she blew our minds, but that's not hard. But you write in here about the sort of the mystery of it all and how massive and large it is. So can you say more about how we conceive of God kept pace with what we know about the cosmos, or perhaps more accurately said, has not kept pace?
Yeah, right. Well, first of all, thank you for reading most of the afterword.
Well, yeah,
nobody
I just wanted to get
buy
as
the
much
book
of it
anymore.
Well, yeah,
So
that's true. Yeah,
that was your ploy, wasn't it?
That was it all along.
That was your intention all along.
Decrease the sales. I'm all about that.
Yeah. Well, the way I will put it this way is that let me just make sort of a statement, and that is that the way we talk about God, the way we understand God and think about God, it has always been informed by how we know or understand anything else. Mm-hmm. That's not new, right? Right. When you look at biblical conceptions of God, and let's say the Hebrew Bible, it's very much not just influenced by is too weak a word. It baked into those descriptions are ancient ways of thinking. And when I say ancient, I don't mean, oh, poor, stupid ancient people. I just mean it was a part of their culture. And so they thought of God as a warrior, for example, or, somebody who tends vines or things like that, or a potter, or a king for that matter. These are things that don't mean a lot to us today. We sort of think they do because they're in the Bible, but if you think about it for a second, we can't really relate to a lot of these things. So our God talk is always affected by what people around us are thinking, what the cultures are sort of how they think about the nature of reality. It's also affected by changes in philosophy,
Mhm.
changes in technology. And that's always been the case. This is the history of theology in both Judaism and Christianity. This is something very, very important.
Mhm.
And so if we think of God, for example, as up there somewhere looking down, I mean, that's a fine metaphor. It doesn't matter, but can we find better language given the fact, I will say, that there is no such thing as up,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we
Right.
know that now.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
where exactly is God? I mean, thinking of God as a being that has existence that takes up time and space somewhere, right? I mean, where is God? And so maybe God is everywhere, right? Maybe God is in everything and everyone. Maybe God is in every atom, every subatomic particle, and everything. But that's a different way of thinking about God, right? And I guess the question is, here's the thing, okay, for what I will call conservative Protestant Christianity, that grew out of the Reformation and now known as evangelicalism and or fundamentalism. And I don't mean it in a negative way. I'm just trying to be descriptive.
Yeah.
But for conservative Protestant Christianity, our roots, our theological roots, the doctrines that we have, were born during a different cosmology, when the scientific world was very different. But we still tend those categories carefully, like a gardener. We cultivate them. We try to have them still have meaning for us. But God as a mechanistic sort of cosmos, a mechanistic universe, with the planets follow laws and things like that. That was a big shift. Newton was a big shift for people, because it's like, I mean, God's not doing it, it's math doing it. So what the deism, God's just off someplace watching, right? So that's a possible conclusion. How do we have a personal God today is very much a question when we are confronted with functionally an infinite universe, where there are, I mean, here's the thing. I'm always thinking of ways, because I'm not a scientist. I want it to be, but it involves math, and astronomy involves staying up late at night, which I don't do either one of those. It's not gonna happen. So I just don't want to do it. So, but I very much respect science enough to say right off the bat, I don't know what I'm talking about. I just know what I've read, and I've sort of absorbed things. But I always look for analogies to help me understand this stuff. And I would tell my students, like, imagine, just blink, just humor me now, even you guys, just right now, just on the count of 3, blink. 1, 2, 3, blink. That blink took 4/10 of a second. That's about the length of time it takes to blink. During that time, light traveled 75,000 miles.
Wow.
Oof. Holy moly.
That's 3 times around the earth, which means nothing to us. But here's something that means something to me. New York to LA and back again, that round trip's 5,000 miles. Wow. So by the time it took you to blink, blink again, 1, 2, 3, blink. That blink, you made 15 round trips cross country, New York to LA and back again.
Wow.
That's how fast.
Like
it blows your mind. And that's, I mean, imagine sitting on an airplane and just making that trip 15 times.
Oh my gosh.
It's incredible to me, and we measure things, of course, in light seconds and light minutes and usually light years, and sometimes millions and billions of light years. And it's oppressive to think about that. To get to the nearest star, you would have to travel. I mean, it's 15 round trips in a blink of an eye, but it's about 37 round trips in a second. That's 186,000 miles, which is roughly the speed of light, right? So the nearest star, just the nearest star in our galaxy, would take about 4.3 light years to reach.
Wow.
So imagine doing that every second, right? Of every minute, of every hour, of every day for 4.3 years. That's the nearest star. The nearest galaxy is about 2.3 million light years away.
Incredible.
Right. So you have to do that trip every second for 2.3 million years. And that's just the nearest galaxy. And there are estimated hundreds of billions, perhaps even trillions of galaxies in the cosmos, all so far away from each other that most of space is 96% of space is empty.
Right.
The Milky Way is about, I think, 1 or 200,000 light years across. Speed of light, 200,000 years to get across our galaxy. You know,
Yeah.
so the question is, okay, if God exists, what kind of a God are we talking about?
Oh,
You know, and
trying to
what does
wrap
it mean for
that,
this God to be personal,
Yeah.
and what does it mean for this God to be involved in our lives? And one way of reconciling that, which is not terribly new, but it's, you know, God is spirit and and pervades all matter, all reality, right? Including each person, each living, each created thing. And to me, and again, you know, your listeners don't have to agree with anything that I say, neither do you, but for me, that makes me think of a pantheistic model of the nature of God, which is God is in actually everyone and everything. God is personal. I believe that. I don't know what it means really, because he's not up there sitting on a throne looking down talking to us.
Right.
But if God is in us, God is deeply personal,
Right.
and God is also the energy. And I hate saying force because people keep making fun of that because of Star Wars, but God is the energy that enlivens the entire cosmos and is driving it in an evolutionary direction, which is also chance and random selection and all those kinds of things, but that's still part of it. So, you know, how do we talk, in other words, of a creator God with a cosmos that we have, where everything is a product of an evolutionary process, which is random?
Yeah.
You know, if you went back to the Big Bang, scientists talk like this, I don't get it. If you go back to the Big Bang and start all over again, we might not be here.
Yeah.
It
Could
might be
go
a
a
whole
different
different evolution.
Could be go a different way altogether.
I could be a Red Sox fan, which would be,
wouldn't that be awful?
All right,
that would be horrible. Or Canadian, even worse.
Or Canadian.
I mean, I don't know
No,
what-
you could be.
Yeah.
But I was thinking of the term that we preachers like to use a lot because we don't have a better one. We talk about, you know, entering into the mystery of God.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, that's why it has to be a mystery. Like, how could you wrap your head around that? It's not something that you can delineate and figure out.
Yeah.
So
That might be disappointing to people, but it's not to me, because it takes the pressure off.
Yeah.
You know, of like, okay, I have to wrap my head around all this. It's like, no, and then you can start focusing on a lot of the stuff that our tradition and our biblical tradition actually does talk about, which is how do you see God in other people, and how do you treat them as a result?
So what you're saying is both deeply incarnational in a way. Like, I mean, it's
Go figure, Christianity. But
and at the same time, sort of like, you know, wildly cosmological, right? Like, it's this God is so large in this conversation, and what we tend to find, particularly in certain circles, is God gets reduced down to a very small concept, which is what I like about this book, in that it challenges those who've been trapped into sort of this myopic thinking about having to sort of use a framework which you've identified in this book is no longer really that useful. Like, we're trying to judge something through a plane that no longer exists. We don't think those things anymore.
And that means God is unintelligible.
Yeah.
In a sense, you know, not that it's not a matter of grasping God, but if we think of God in pre-Einsteinian, pre-quantum, pre-Hubble telescope ways of thinking, it's like, really? I mean, that's what I don't believe in a man up in the sky. Well, neither do I, but I understand why you say that, because that's how people talk. And again, metaphorically, it's fine.
Right.
Yeah.
You know,
and it is incredibly freeing too, as you mentioned, in that, you know, how many, in a pastoral sense, how many people have come to you, Kevin, and me, and the pain that they're suffering and the difficulty they're going through is to get an answer as to why God did this or didn't do that, or they need to know. So they come to the pastor and say, you can tell me. But that's the source of their pain, is knowing, as opposed to being free to say, I don't have to know.
Right.
There's,
to not know and to proceed with faith with not knowing is a very healthy exercise. Because it's acknowledging the greatness of God. Actually, it's like you said, you know, it's acknowledging the mystery of God. Which
and not only that, Rob, but how often do we get people, like, I mean, this is the thing that I like about this work, is it liberates people to be able to say, because I mean, what, we're going to get up on Sunday and pretend that we all live in a pre-Hubble telescope, space exploration, pre-time, which is almost what we do from a liturgical perspective. And so we should not be surprised when people come to us and say, look, I don't believe this shit. You know,
Yeah.
like it's like, you know, or they're afraid to say to us because the language we use sort of continues to behave in such a way that we're back there. And then so
Right.
we have all kinds of people who attend on a Sunday morning who, if you got right down to what they really thought, would say, well, I've accepted what I know from science, so I can't reconcile the two.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. And to create, I think, cultures and churches that can model the normalcy of these
Yes.
kinds of
Mhm.
discussions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, there are churches that create new liturgies. Well,
That's
we
right.
don't do that.
Yeah.
Well, churches have created liturgies since forever. It isn't like,
That's
oh
right.
no,
Oh, no.
we're doing something new here. You know, it's not. And you know, again, the thing is that we've always adapted. I say we, the Christian tradition has always adapted how it talks about God according to prevailing ways of thinking, which, you know, largely it's philosophical, scientific, and even technological.
Right.
Mhm.
The telescope is a piece of technology that did change how people thought. It's you know, I have this great quote from Blaise Pascal, you know, the mathematician philosopher, who says the infinite eternity of the infinite spaces terrifies me. It's something like
Yes,
that. It's
that's
a
right.
beautiful quote.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I came across another quote the other day from a 18th century Greek Orthodox theologian, Nicodemus of the Holy Mountain. I never heard of the guy.
Well, me either.
Apparently he was quite a guy though, but he said, the cosmos is an ocean and our minds drown in it,
Wow.
Ooh.
which is beautiful.
I
It's
like
like,
that. See,
yeah,
that's
okay,
fantastic.
I can just be a person now. I don't
Yeah.
have to be somebody who makes believe they know how everything works. I
Right.
can't find my glasses half the time and they're on my head. Like, I'm not, this
That's
is
a
above
line.
my pay grade.
That
Yeah.
line belongs in a Eucharistic prayer.
Yes, I think so.
That's
Yeah.
Or
Isn't it
Ian,
beautiful?
Ian,
Yeah.
that's a song, buddy.
Yeah.
Ian's a
I'll write it
songwriter.
down.
You
Oh,
gotta-
really?
Write it down.
Okay.
Yeah,
Put the
definitely,
guitar
yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Hop to it, Ian.
So
Yeah.
again, we want to get back to the book again, The Evolution of Adam, divided into two parts. One part focuses on Adam and the other part on the writings of Paul. So I wanted to have a little conversation about
Okay.
Adam. And you point out that while many folks are kind of comfortable with, or at least know something of evolution, many are not so versed in the workings of biblical criticism. And as you point out, many Christians take the word criticism to be a negative thing. I remember hearing it first in seminary when the professor told me we would be critical of the Bible. And I went, oh no.
Don't criticize my Bible.
Don't criticize my Bible.
My pretty
So
Bible.
understanding a few things about, you know, history and authorship and context, we've already kind of touched on that, are very important. So let's start with who's writing about Adam. And I just wanted to read a quote from the book. First, concerning the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the traditional view was that one man named Moses, living in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC, was solely, more or less, responsible for writing all 5 books. A few pre-modern readers had already begun to question the traditional view, however gently, but it is not until about the 17th and 18th centuries that we actually begin to see some earlier questions bubble over into detailed arguments for why the Pentateuch could not have been written by one man at one time in the 2nd millennial BC. And then building on the work of Wellhausen, you point out that current scholarship asserts that the Pentateuch was not authored out of whole cloth by a 2nd millennium, but is the end product of a very complex process, written and oral or both, that did not come to a close until the post-exilic period. So I wonder, Peter, if you could talk to our listeners a little bit about why these books are most likely written post-exile by someone other than Moses. That might be a shock for some. But more importantly, why that really matters.
I'll say it again. You guys keep writing my book, I'm going to hang up.
Yeah,
My book, I'm going to hang up because it's like, you know.
Our
anyway,
experience
no, I'm just
is our experience is people want more.
That's
okay,
right.
well, that's good. So yeah, I guess you know, there are several reasons why scholars say, listen, it doesn't look like Moses or one person wrote this. It looks like several people, and not a Moses living, because Moses would have lived around the middle of the second millennium, roughly. A lot of scholars say around 1300 BC. That's usually a rough date given for Moses and the time of Moses. But one thing is just the fact that the Pentateuch is written in the third person. It's about Adam, it's about Abraham, it's about Jacob, it's about, and then it's, about Joseph, and then it's about Moses. Moses is written about in the third person. Somebody is writing a story of a history, and people don't normally write about themselves in the third person unless they're in the NBA, and they always talk about themselves in the third person.
That's right.
Yeah. Anyway, that always cracks me up. But so I mean, that's one thing to ponder. And there are moments in the Pentateuch that you have the writer saying things like, "No, Moses was more humble than any man on the face of the earth." It's unlikely Moses wrote that.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
You have, at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, for example. I mean, I'm just picking here almost at random things from throughout the Pentateuch, but at the beginning of Deuteronomy, these are the words Moses spoke on the other side of the Jordan. Now, if you know the story of Moses died.
Yes.
Before he got into Canaan. He died on the other side. So whoever's writing this is on the side of the Jordan that Moses never got to. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And at the end of Deuteronomy in chapter 34, and to this day, no one knows where his body is buried. To this day is a phrase that pops up a lot in the Pentateuch, and it means a significant length of time. To this day. It isn't like, Moses wrote the Pentateuch and talked about his death in the past tense. Right.
Yeah.
Or maybe some people say, okay, well, he didn't write that part, but Joshua wrote it, the guy, his sort of his second in command. But to this day, no one knows where his body was buried. It's like, it's a week later and people are like, where did we put him? Anybody remember anywhere?
Anybody see Moses around?
Yeah.
It makes no sense, right? It's
Moses. What do we do with
a lot of time? What do we do with the guy? It's like time seems to have passed by. And right after that, it says, no prophet has arisen in Israel like Moses. Well, that is only a compelling thing if a lot of time has passed, right? And probably written at a time when there were prophets.
Yes.
And prophets don't start in Israel until the monarchic period.
There you go.
Right. The earliest written prophet is probably Hosea and maybe Isaiah or parts of Isaiah and Amos. They're like late 8th century prophets, that hundreds and hundreds of years later. So it seems from those kinds of things, anachronisms, things that don't make sense, like the reference to Philistines is always curious to scholars because Philistines didn't land until about 1200 BC. They came probably from, Greek islands, and they came down. And we know from pottery and scholars have a way of figuring this stuff out. But, it's things like that, things that just don't make any sense. And Deuteronomy has Moses talking about the conquest of Canaan in the past tense. That happens in chapter 4. It's like, okay, how does that happen? Well, maybe Moses didn't write that, but somebody writing in Moses's voice did that, right? So, and then the question becomes, well, how long after Moses was this stuff written? And unfortunately, that gets into a lot more complicated stuff that I'm not condescending. It's just, it's hard to do this in a podcast. You almost have to see the text in front of you.
Right.
But
we tried reading it all, Peter. Like what?
I know. We could. Yeah. Start at the beginning. But the opinion of scholars, and I very much share this opinion, is that the Pentateuch doesn't exist as we know it until after the Babylonian exile,
right?
Which is late 6th century, probably even later 5th century. Some scholars even put it later than that. That doesn't mean it was written then,
right? But
it means the traditions were collected and then brought together, and some of them were early, some of them were later. There are things in the Pentateuch that seem to be really post-exilic. Right. And there are other things that seem to be much older. The Adam and Eve story, a lot of scholars say that's one of the older things in the Bible, maybe 10th century, even earlier than that, right? Genesis chapter 1, a lot of scholars think that seems to be exilic or post-exilic, and they have reasons for saying that. It's not just, let's be weird today about the Bible. They have academic, scholarly reasons for saying that. They're not attacking the Bible. They're just trying to understand why it looks the way that it does. So that's a big part of it, Rob. We could go on and on, but there are reasons why people say it. And can I add just one quick thing to this?
Yeah.
There was a rabbi, Abraham ibn Ezra. I mentioned him in the book, around 1100.
Yeah.
And he is reading a passage in Genesis 12:6, where God is taking Abraham on a tour of the land of Canaan, right? Because I'm going to give you this land and all children, and here are the borders and all kind of stuff. And the narrator says, now the Canaanites were still in the land at that time. And this rabbi said, he who understands it will keep quiet. He understood the implications of saying the Canaanites were still in the land at that time, right, because that implies that this was written at a time when the Canaanites weren't in the land.
That's right.
Right. It's just these little throwaway lines you come across in Genesis even. And it's fascinating. It's like, man, I'm really trying to understand here when this stuff was written and why, you know?
Yeah. You write about the church's self-definition, and you do so by pointing to Israel's declaration. And I think the sort of thing is that, if we pick up on that theme, that the Pentateuch is post-exilic and shapes an identity and a response to a situation that and if that's Israel's historical moment of national crisis, which drove their theologians to engage in their past creativity, you write, the first follower of Jesus were in an analogous situation. Their view of that same history was shaped by their own defining moment, not of crisis, but of good news. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, in the same way that the exile really drove the ancient Israelites to think about who are we and what's God up to?
Yeah.
And this isn't going according to plan. Is God still with us? And I would just say, add to that, Kevin, that it's not just the Pentateuch, it's the Hebrew Bible as a whole did not come together. The Pentateuch, some of the earlier stuff. But even in Jesus's day, it's pretty clear there's some flexibility, even with like what Psalms are contained in the book of Psalms. I mean, there's flexibility going on for quite a while. But anyway, it's the crisis moment that drove them to think about who they are, which is very common. We tend to reflect spiritually when we're in crisis, not when the new church building was just built and we have a lot of people coming and our softball team is doing really well. We don't think about it that way. It's when everything's falling apart. For the early followers of Jesus, it was the faith that this Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God, even though that had to be re-understood in different ways than Jews would have understood it at the time. But that was the moment that actually also drove the New Testament writers, especially Paul, to rethink what does it mean to be a child of Abraham, right? And it's not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And it's not a crisis, it's more a culmination, a climax, so to speak, of the story. At least that's how Paul understood it. So, it's interesting how one thing I love about the Bible is that it keeps moving. It's not like the same thing is said over and over again. You have different perspectives, different spiritual conclusions drawn by people living at different times. Post-exilic literature is different than pre-exilic literature.
Right.
Everything's great. The temple's fine.
Yeah.
God would never turn his back on us. It's his temple. We built it for him. He lives here, for heaven's sake, right?
Yeah.
But then it's gone. It's like, maybe God's bigger than us. You have Jonah. Maybe God cares about the ancient enemies, the Assyrians, even though Nahum doesn't. It says God destroys them and everybody's happy. All that kind of stuff, right? So, and the New Testament is very similar. Another way of putting it is that God's always out ahead of the people.
Yes.
And there's always something happening, and something new is going to happen. And the New Testament is rightly called that because it is a new thing, where certain things about how God was thought to be were being questioned and were being rethought. In some cases radically so, in other cases maybe just a nip and tuck or something, but still, you have a movement that God is behind that doesn't care about the land of Israel.
And if that has radical implications for us today, if the notion is that God is out in front of it, that God is already at work, we talk about this in terms of, how do we as an institution respond to what God is already up to? you know, and
Right.
that in terms of that large cosmos stuff too, right? I mean, it's like,
Mhm.
if indeed there's something bigger than ourselves, and if God is at work and we hang out in our little buildings doing our little thing in our silos, that
Mhm.
has some implications for us. I mean,
Right.
if God's out ahead of it, what are we doing?
Right. And I think God out ahead of this is like, what else do you expect?
Yes.
Right. I mean,
Exactly. Yeah.
and I think sometimes we think of God as more, you know, the caricature of the Pharisees. It's, you know, the New Testament doesn't give a fair shake to the Pharisees. Everybody sort of knows that. But
Yes.
Mhm.
the caricature of the Pharisees is like, you know, always going back to the book and you have to do what it says. And I think sometimes we think of God that way too. It's like, you know, we're thinking like, gee, I wonder, how do we think about God in view of the cosmos?
Right.
Well, okay, what does the book of Acts say?
Yeah.
It's you go back to the book or
Yeah, go
something,
back
and it's
to the-
like that's part of the tradition of Christianity, these foundational books.
Yes.
And as foundational books, you build upon the foundations. And you build upon the foundations not because you don't trust the book, but because the book is something that's worthy of building foundations upon. But the question is always, what is God doing? And that's a matter of discernment and wisdom, and
Yes.
sometimes just being flat out wrong.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
that's because we're human. We get to be wrong sometimes. Right.
Yeah.
Walter Brueggemann, you know, he talks about the
Yes.
Bible as a compost pile.
Yes. Yeah. I love that.
I love that image, right? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
the stuff grows out of it. That's the
Yep.
thing. And I think sometimes we're always focusing on the compost pile itself and not the things that can potentially grow out of it,
Right.
which is risky,
Yes.
right? It's
And-
not an inerrantist perspective on the Bible. It's more, what is God doing, you know, and how does that go beyond the, let's say, the limitations of the Bible, because it's a historical document.
Yes.
And to talk about the limitations of the Bible makes people nervous. But I would argue, I mean, this is, you know, how the Bible actually works. This is what that book is about. The whole Bible's full of these examples of
That's right.
God doing something that people didn't
Yep.
expect.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Ian, we got Ian all excited about Gilgamesh, so he had to ask this question.
Yeah, I was told Gilgamesh as I joined, and I was like, okay, we'll ask about that.
It's
So
very
you write
important
about
it's very important that you figure out about Gilgamesh. Ian.
for sure. You write about the importance of genre and knowing what Genesis is and what it is not. You write, if we want to have a meaningful conversation between evolution and Christianity, we cannot impose up Genesis questions it was never intended to answer. You encourage readers to engage Genesis on a level that is faithful to the world to which it was addressed. So can you tell us about the archaeological discoveries in the 19th century that were like game changers to this? And tell me who in the world Gilgamesh is.
Well, okay. So, I mean, there are a couple of texts that are relevant for this. One is, 19th century text. One is scholars call it the Enuma Elish.
Mhm.
And it's a Babylonian text and probably has its origins early 2nd millennium BC. And it's called that because those are the first two words of the book, when on high. This is written in the Akkadian language, which is a bizarre language, by the way, but that's a whole other podcast. But, there you have stories of creation that there's overlap between Genesis 1, right?
Mhm.
So that's one example. Then you have a couple of stories that have from the ancient world that have flood stories in them. And one of them is the Gilgamesh epic. And Gilgamesh was a king who basically was a total jerk, but then grew up. And he came to terms with his own death at the end. And there's no eternal life. The only person that has eternal life is this guy Utnapishtim, who is the Noah figure in the Gilgamesh story, right? Because he's basically Gilgamesh's friend Enkidu dies. And he's freaking out and a bunch of stuff happens. But then he says, I know, I'll get the answer from this guy who survived the flood because he has eternal life. And he goes and talks to him and says, can I get some of that? He goes, no, it's just for me. I'm special. However, if you want to live forever, build buildings, be a great king, leave a legacy. That's how you live forever, right? But there's a flood story in there. And also the Atrahasis epic, which is another ancient Babylonian story. Atrahasis is the name of the key figure. And that has a flood story that's really, really close to Genesis. And not just Genesis, the flood story, but actually like chapters 2 through 8 it follows the pattern of the Atrahasis epic very closely. So what that did was it just drove people to sort of see, my goodness gracious, this literature in the Bible has a context.
Yeah.
And these other nations, that older stories, they're all sort of breathing the same air. And it may not be that the biblical writer is copying from any of them. He may be. I mean, some people think that about Atrahasis. It's so, the patterns of the story are so similar. But even there, if not, it's not that they're copying. It's just that they're breathing the same air, and they think about the nature of it. There's a way of telling your stories, and this is the template, right? And it's really relevant, I think. So when we read Genesis and we expect of like an Adam and Eve story, historical accuracy, and almost like if you were there, you would have seen these things. We wouldn't say this about any of these other ancient stories for good reason.
Right.
And I'm more interested in what is the biblical writer trying to communicate theologically by talking this way about God. And to me, that's almost a foundational question to ask. And I think the more you do that, I tell people, even forget evolution,
right,
just on the basis of ancient Near Eastern archaeology, like you were saying, Ian, and just finding these texts, I would conclude that the Adam and Eve story is not historical in any way that we think of history.
right,
Just on that basis. Now you throw evolution into it, it's like, well, come on, why are we
Yeah.
still talking about this, right?
right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
And
Well,
the
let's-
reason we're talking about it is because people freak out. That's why. And
Well,
I
yeah, there's
understand
still,
why.
but there's still people
Exactly.
freaking out. Just turn on the news. It's like crazy.
Yeah. So Adam and Eve, come back to Sunday school here, a little story in Genesis. So I wanted to talk a little bit about that. If we blew you away with the whole Moses might not have written the whole Pentateuch thing, I wanted to talk to Peter about the two creation stories. Okay, here we go again.
Yeah.
Right. So whoever is responsible for Genesis 1 to 11, as you write, certainly seems comfortable allowing distinct accounts to rest side by side. The reason for this may simply be that the final editor of Genesis wished to preserve Israel's own diverse traditions, or perhaps was obligated to, owing to the weight of tradition that was behind them. That these stories appear side by side has theological value. Genesis 1 tells the story of creation as a whole by the one sovereign God, and Genesis 2 focuses early and specifically on Israel's story. Once the differences are accepted for what they are, an implication for the evolution discussion becomes immediately apparent. Concern over historical or scientific matters is driven by a modern mindset, not an ancient one. And there we go with context again. So the literary evidence from the ancient Near East points to creation stories written not as historical accounts, right? And as you point out, growing knowledge of the cultures, religions, and worldviews of the ancient world in which the Israelites lived, thought, wrote, and worshipped has significantly reoriented our expectation of what Genesis is prepared to deliver. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure. Yeah, I think about the expectations. I call it genre calibration. You know, when you calibrate a tool, you sort of zero it out again. And I think these literatures have helped us understand something of the genre of Genesis and what we can expect from it. There are plenty of things about the Old Testament that are actually fairly unique. I mean, these long historical narratives and the kings and things like that. You don't really, at least from what we have now, we don't know of anything that looks like that. But there are other parts that really do look like other things. And laws are one of them. Proverbs is another one. And these creation stories and the flood story, those are other places where you see it. And understanding that a little bit can just help us not impose expectations on these texts that, again, they're just not able to bear, right? And so you do have these two stories. I mean, that's the other issue too. You have these two stories where in chapter 1, it's, there's an order, 6 days, and on the 6th day, the animals are created, and then humanity at the end. And then you have, and it's water and chaos, and God is making everything right, and he's creating light. And then in Genesis 2, you have God creating one man, Adam, which means man in Hebrew, by the way. He creates Adam out of the Adamah. Adamah is ground. So he creates Adam out of the ground. It's a beautiful pun, right? So he creates first Adam, then the animals, because Adam's lonely, and God says, this isn't going to work. I'll just create other animals. And at the end, it's like, but still a suitable helper was not found for him. Right. And so he goes, I know what I'll do. Puts him to sleep, takes not a rib, but actually probably his side. It's almost like duplicating him in the sense, peeling him off, and makes a woman from that. And then when Adam wakes up, what does he say? It's this great line in Genesis. Now, at last, bone of my bone. Finally,
flesh of my
plan
flesh.
A was the animals. Plan B was the the woman. But the thing is that you've got Adam, then the animals, then the woman.
Right.
It's not animals and then the mass of humanity. Right, it's one person, then the animals and woman. You can't reconcile those two stories. And I would put it this way: it's patently obvious that we shouldn't try to reconcile them, but we should try to understand what's the purpose of putting these stories in this order. Because editors who took stories and fused them together were not stupid. I think they were trying to say something. And the question is, what were they trying to say? Well, that's the fun of biblical scholarship and theology and hermeneutics and trying to understand that stuff. And hey, this is what I think. Oh, I hadn't thought about that. That's a really good idea. It's fantastic. My teacher, James Kugel, a Jewish scholar, he talks about how Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 portray the two visions of God that we have throughout the entire Hebrew Bible. The one who's aloof and high above and looking down, and the other one who's very intimate with his creation. So we have, in theological language, we have the transcendent God of Genesis 1 and the immanent God of Genesis 2. And they're both there at the beginning, sort of setting the stage for, oh God, why are you so far off? How much longer do we have to wait for you to show up? And then God is, with them in a pillar of fire and smoke, taking them over the Red Sea, right? So it's that you meet both gods. And I think that has to reflect something of Israelite spirituality, which is ours too, that sometimes you feel close to God. Sometimes like, God has been a no-show for about 10 years in my life, and I don't know what to do about it. It's like, welcome to the club. This is the way it is.
Right.
So
that's great.
And I think it's really cool.
Yeah, it is cool. And I think, because it speaks to to a diversity, like you said, of, and I think you write in there too about, remembering you write about sort of the ideas of monotheism and the whole idea of God as we, right? There's that sort of discourse in Genesis 1, in an image of God, we created them. I wonder if you can say a word about that before I go on to.
Yeah, it's interesting because you have a couple of times in Genesis, let us create humanity in our own image, and people says, who's the we? Like, hey, does God have a mouse in his pocket? What's the we happening? And that is a very good
Bojangles.
Yes. But people have said, and here I'm John Calvin, he pointed out that a lot of Christians think this is the Trinity. And Calvin, who's no liberal, said that's dumb. They wouldn't have understood it. That would have meant nothing to them. So I think he takes an understanding that's sort of like the royal we, which is an understandable conclusion, but it's really, really not unlikely, because you don't really see that in the Bible. God never says we, he says I. Right. When prophets speak for God, they say I. So it's usually first person singular. But the other the standard way of explaining this, which I agree with in biblical scholarship, is that the Israelites envisioned a very active, divine heavenly sphere, right? Where, Israel's God is sometimes called the Most High, because he's above all the others.
Compared to something else,
Right, compared to something else, right? And there are even levels in heaven, and depending on who you ask, Paul, there was the third heaven that he went up to, and there are other things in the ancient world where it's 7, is it 40, just whatever, but Israel's God is the Most High, right? And he's speaking to these other divine creatures in the divine council, it's usually called, and they don't do anything. Israel's God, simply called God, Elohim, in this first, not Yahweh by his name, but just a title. he does everything. And I shouldn't say he, but in the Bible, it is a he. I don't think God's a male. But that is what's happening there. The assumption of a active divine counsel, divine realm.
Yeah.
And that's why, like you were saying, Kevin, you have these comparisons, right?
Yeah.
Which happen quite a lot. And, the Exodus story is fueled by it. It's like, I'm better than the gods of Egypt. Let me show you.
Yeah.
Right.
Hold my beer.
Exactly. That's sort of what it is. Like,
That's right.
hold my beer. I'll give you the choice, Pharaoh, of when you want this plague to stop and start. It's just, I'll give you the choice. And you guys can't even make it stop. I'll make it stop and start. You tell me.
Yeah.
So it's no trick. So hold my beer is pretty much what it is.
My beer. I'll look after this for you. So I mean, it's in that notion of that very active God. I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned the flood story and the parallels in Gilgamesh and so on, but just on a broad stroke thing, I mean, like, this is something that often gets asked. I mean, God kills every human being apart from blessed Noah and his family and all the creatures and so on, except for
which
one.
didn't work out, by the way.
No, it didn't. It didn't work out very well.
Yeah.
Supposed to make us all better again, but we're still at it. No less in today's world, as you say, that do we still struggle with this stuff? But God's destruction of all life has raised serious questions about the nature of this God of Israel that people will certainly ask us about sometimes. Well, what kind of a God is that of yours anyway that wipes out everybody like it was? So
why did he keep the mosquitoes? That's what my mother always asked.
Why did he keep the mosquitoes? We're here about a God who's satisfied to give in to God's temper, but there are other contextual stories from the time that you point to that say, well, maybe it's not, maybe it wasn't, maybe God was being patient. I wonder if you could share a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, in ancient Judaism, there were other stories about, God's patience, because he was already hacked off with Cain and Abel.
Right.
And it's actually, there's some say that one Jewish source says that Cain is the actual cause of the flood, but God was just being patient for like 10 generations until Noah came around, which is interesting because everyone's
that's a lot of patience. 10 generations is a long time.
God is patient, right? That's the thing, because otherwise it's chapter 6 of the Bible and everybody dies, right? That's what you have. Right. Like God's already out of ideas.
Yes,
right.
That's right.
But again, I just, I mean, I love talking about that in groups because that's a really good place to sort of land and say, listen, what do you think God is like? Do you think God has to kill everybody and start over again? And I don't think so. I don't believe that. And it's for a whole lot of reasons I don't believe that. But I think the ancient Israelites did, and not because they were stupid, but because they were ancient Israelites. And we have a flood story from other cultures, and what they're saying about themselves and about God differs in those stories. They're not saying the same thing. It's the Atrahasis epic is wonderful because it seems like the flood came because the people were making too much noise and the gods couldn't get their sleep.
Yes, right. Well, that's always troublesome.
Yeah.
Which is actually a really good reason to kill everybody. If you ask me, because I need my naps too. But
I'm with you 100%.
I got to get up in the morning.
But in Genesis, it's not that. It's there's something about crossing the boundaries between the divine realm and the earthly realm, and the heart of humanity is only wicked all the time, and their inclination to evil is there. It doesn't give a reason for why humanity has these inclinations, but it still says like things are so corrupt, God has to start over. And that's just feeding off of ancient Near Eastern things and the reality of a local flood. I mean, people talk about this a lot. There was a cataclysmic flood around 2300 BC, and an even bigger one about 10,000 BC, that people say this is part of the cultural memory. And people were always asking, why are the gods doing this to us? Because the gods control weather. We don't have dams. We can't have shelters against this stuff. And we do this today too, by the way. Why did God send a tsunami? What's God doing here? We ask the same questions today. But and each culture gave its own theological answer to that. And in the biblical story, it's paving the way for the people of Israel. That starts with, in earnest, it starts with Abraham.
Yeah, and it's incredible when you think about what you said earlier about how many light years away the Milky Way is, or the nearest star, and all that. And if you're in the ancient Near East, far away is not very far away.
Yeah.
Right. So
exactly.
I mean, a flood, that wipes out the world, doesn't have to go too far to wipe out the world.
The world. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Right. Exactly. Right.
The world
what
that
you just said, Kevin,
is...
I love what you just said too about just bringing the cosmos into it, because again, you look at it and say, the creator of the infinite and immensely complicated and unknowable cosmos says, I'm just going to kill you. I don't know what to do. Right. It strains credulity. It doesn't make sense for us today. And it's okay to say that. That's really my main point. It's okay to say that does not make sense.
Right.
And you only have to leave the Christian faith if you think these texts are giving us the final word on the nature of God.
Right.
And that God is always back in the stories. God is not alive and moving forward along with the rest of us.
Just for a final question today, Peter, I don't want to leave out good old Paul, main
Paul.
player in the New Testament, good buddy Paul. So let's make our last question today about kind of the implications of Paul's use of the Old Testament in shaping his Christology and how he understood Jesus. So for Paul, Jesus is the new Adam, kind of the solution to the fallenness of everything. Right. And you write this: God's solution through the resurrection of Christ reveals the deep foundational plight of the human condition. And Paul expresses that fact in the biblical idiom available to him. Paul's reading of the Adam story was conditioned by his experience of the risen Christ. And as Paul does so often in his use of the Old Testament in general, he interprets Adam in such a way as to highlight the work of Christ and the equality of Jew and Gentile. The death and resurrection of the Son of God was a surprise ending to Israel's story, for sure. No one familiar with the Old Testament messianic hope was prepared for a crucified, let alone a risen Messiah. And Paul, as a first century Jew, bore witness to God's act in Christ in the only way that he could have been expected to, through ancient idioms and categories known to him and his religious tradition for century upon century. One can therefore believe that Paul is correct about the problem of sin and death and the solution that God provides in Christ, without also needing to believe that his assumptions about human origins are accurate. The need for a savior does not require a historical Adam. Mm-hmm. Can you say more about the importance of this for our listeners?
Yeah. I mean, I've heard many people say that if evolution's true, the gospel's false. Therefore, evolution can't be true.
Okay.
Right. And I understand that. I think it's wrong, but I understand the sentiment, the mentality behind that. And to try to push against that conclusion, I try to put Paul in his context. I mean, people will have to read the book to get the details, but how Paul understood Adam was very creatively for his needs of the moment, which is just the way other Jews understood Adam in what they were writing about, the Jews around Paul's time and a little bit earlier. And for Paul, the resurrection showed Paul that the problem that God is trying to solve, the problem that God is solving is death. Death comes from Adam. And guess what? Death is something that Jews and Gentiles have in common, right?
Right.
As opposed to thinking, for example, that for some strands of Judaism, at least, the problem that we faced historically is not being faithful to the covenant, not being faithful to Torah. And in order to prepare the way for the Messiah, we need to maintain covenant fidelity. So the problem was failure to keep Torah. The solution is keep Torah. Mm-hmm. What Paul does is he takes Torah and he basically moves it from the center of God's plan, so to speak, and puts it, he doesn't throw it out, but he puts it more on the periphery, a little bit on the outside, and replaces it with Jesus. Jesus is the solution to the deeper problem, which is death. Right. When in Romans 5, when Paul talks about condemnation has come to all, that doesn't mean you go to hell when you die. It means the condemnation is that we all die.
We all die.
Right.
That's the condemnation. And that's the condemnation that Jesus reverses and brings life to. Oddly enough, Paul says to all, not just people go to church. Then he says many, and it's like, Paul, pick a word and just stick with it and don't make us think so hard.
But
about
it is
stuff.
Paul.
It is Paul who's just like needs an editor desperately. So, so I think that Paul is saying something. He's being whisked away by this Jesus faith, which defies explanation. And he's trying to talk about it as, in the quote that you read, according to the idioms that people understood, which is Israel's story, which is Adam, right? And it's Adam had an effect, death, sin entered the world, and there was death, and we're still reaping the problems with that. There's sin in the world. He doesn't say Adam caused the sin that everybody sins. He just says there's sin in the world, and there's death, and the second Adam is here to get rid of all that. Right. We're not a slave to sin anymore, or a slave to death.
Right. Interestingly to me, you point out in the book that, like if you pick up your Bible and you read, and you start in Genesis 1, you'll read about Adam, and you really don't hear much about Adam again until you get to Paul.
Yeah, in the Bible you don't. Yeah. Actually, not at all. They're just in the genealogy in First Chronicles. That's the only time he pops up, and you could make the case that like Moses is sort of an Adam. Abraham, there's a starting overness, which I think is good, but still the person of Adam is not an issue. Until the Judaism of like maybe 100 years or so before Paul, they started thinking about it, and there are reasons for that. Why start thinking about it, but they did.
Wow, this is great stuff. We could go on and on and on. Love this.
We could.
Dr. Peter Enns is our guest today on the Vicar's Crossing. Peter, thank you so much for your time, for taking time out on your sabbatical to do this for us. We appreciate it.
Absolutely, yeah.
The book is The Evolution of Adam. There it is there. We encourage people to.
If you're on YouTube, you
out.
can see this. If you're not, I'm feeling up the wall, which has the poster of The Evolution of Adam on it.
And you can find that and many of Peter's books on our website at thevicarscrossing.com under books. So check that out. And of course, we want to plug your podcast too, which is the Bible for Normal People, which excludes Kevin and I, but that's okay.
We're not.
But it's an excellent podcast, and we really want to encourage people to check you out there too, Peter. So thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet. Thank you, Robin, Kevin, and Ian. Good to be with you guys.
Thank you so much.
Great. That was fantastic. I always enjoy listening to his podcast. And for those of you that really have an interest in this kind of stuff and want to expand your mind and blow your mind about the Bible and theology and really get into and lift some layers off of it in a lot of ways, right? Yeah. Please, we certainly encourage you to check them out and check out the books too, The Evolution of Adam, Dr. Peter Enns. All right, guys, that wraps up another edition.
Awesome day.
Time is flying. All right. Yep. And again, thanks to our sponsors here at the Vicar's Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated, to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to our friends at Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Hey, right, Robbie, guys? Just remembering that next week, if you're listening to this now, there's going to be a book launch special on Tuesday next week. Our friend of the podcast, the Reverend Michael Korn, just priested recently, just a couple of weeks ago.
He'll be all shiny when we talk.
He'll be shiny. His new book, The Rebel Christ, is being released on Tuesday, and we have a book launch special in celebration of that.
Very good. Looking forward to chatting with Michael again. We had him in London live in person back in the day when we met with people.
Yes, back when we were social.
Yeah, remember that?
Yeah.
Looking forward to seeing him. So anyway, thanks, guys. It's been great. Thanks to Dr. Enns today. Awesome. And until we meet again, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's in London.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's Church.
My name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
And remember, Kevin, to always look both ways.
Before you cross the street, you never know if there's going to be a Gilgamesh coming down the road.
Look out for Gilgamesh.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vicar's Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vicar's Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!